Hi, this is Ilana Levin. I'm co-founder of Organizing 2.0, and welcome to the close of our successful two-day online conference. We've been doing online digital strategy trainings for about 10 or 11 years, but this is our first year of having an entirely virtual conference. I am ecstatic that we've had so many folks join us, 1,700 people coming with us to learn digital strategy and new organizing strategies that we can actually move forward with now during COVID and in the future. I want to thank a few more of our sponsors: SUNY Empire State Harry Van Artsdale School of Labor, Higher Ground Labs, Concerted Action, New Mode, Beth Becker, and the Digital Plan. And now I'm going to introduce Charles Lenchner, my frequent co-conspirator and co-founder of Organizing 2.0. Charles is also co-founder of both Ready for Warren and People for Bernie. He'll be interviewing Claire Sandberg of the Sanders campaign and Kunur Ojha of the Warren campaign about how distributed organizing has changed campaigns and the lessons we can learn from the 2020 primary so far. Now, this session will be appropriate for beginners and advanced attendees. Expect to understand more about the best in modern political campaigning and a chance to hear some inside stories from this year's campaigns.
Thank you, Ilana. Welcome, everybody. Welcome especially, and thank you to Claire and Kunur. It's very exciting for me to be here and moderate this final closing panel. And let's get right to it. And I'm going to be asking Claire first. I would like us to understand the terrain better. In the last few years, there's been a lot of innovative organizing taking place. And one of the buzzwords that comes up a lot is distributed organizing. I've seen something referred to as big organizing, not to be confused with stuff we're not discussing, like deep canvassing. Help us understand why these terms exist and what problem inventing them was meant to solve. Claire, start
I
over.
muted myself. So sorry. First, I just wanted to say thanks so much, Charles and Ilana, for having me. It's really exciting to be here. I think I went to Organizing 2.0 about 10 years ago. And this is definitely the most exciting thing I've done during quarantine. So to answer your great question, Charles, I think that the term big organizing came about as in the 2016 Bernie campaign, we were thinking about how to kind of turn on their head some of the best practices and norms around organizing, starting with things that are small asks and starting with kind of organizing people one at a time as a kind of gold standard. There's been a long current of thought in organizing, starting with Saul Alinsky, with the idea that the best thing that you can do as an organizer is to meet people where they are, start out with a small ask, and then slowly ratchet them up to a larger and larger ask over time, and that's how you build their leadership. And something that we found on the Bernie 2016 campaign, when we were sort of thrown in on the deep end, and we had this challenge of organizing tens of thousands of people who wanted to volunteer, and we had a very small team to do that, was that you could actually start with the people who want to do the most, not with the people who want to do the least. You can ask people to do big things right off the bat, and people actually will say yes. Not everyone, but many people will. And I think that there were a lot of campaigns and organizations that were doing this beforehand, but there wasn't really a name for it. One that comes to mind for me that really inspires me was the Fight for 15, where they rejected some of the traditional rules around organizing in the workplace and union organizing, and seeing organizing a strike as something that you do very long in the future after a lot of building, a lot of leadership development. And they actually started off by asking people, fast food workers who were signing an online petition, right after they signed up, they said, "Are you willing to organize a strike in your workplace, or would you be interested?" And most people said no, but many people said yes. And then that's how the Fight for 15 became so huge, is that they started with people willing to do the most. I think distributed organizing has become kind of a buzzword in the last few years. And yeah, we can talk more about what it means, but that's my short little history of how we started talking about big organizing and distributed organizing. distributed being a way that we could avoid referring to all of this stuff as just digital, because a lot of it is actually not just digital, it's face-to-face stuff too.
Thank you so much. Kunur, I'm going to ask you a less precise question, so bear with me. You worked on the Bernie campaign in 2016, and then you got a senior role on the Warren campaign. So you are coming from a place where you are familiar with these terms, the reality as well as the buzz around this new kind of organizing, and then you shifted to a different terrain with staff who have different political lineages and so on. What does that look like from where you ended up? What kind of language or conversations around organizing were taking place in the Warren campaign that are relevant here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the nature of the conversations were really similar after the Bernie 2016 campaign. It wasn't just Bernie alumni that were talking about distributed organizing and trying, new scalable tactics. It was the whole world of organizing. Every few years, I think the landscape changes a lot, and you'll see a lot of folks in different settings trying to learn from each other. I don't think that that strategy or those tactics are necessarily like tied to one particular person's followers. So we, especially in the early days of the Warren campaign, would have a lot of conversations about what distributed organizing means to us, how different staff on the campaign understand it, with it being such a new term. I think a lot of folks bring themselves into it and understand it a little bit differently. So conversations like the one that we're having right now were certainly things that we were doing on that campaign too. And that continued as we grew too. One more thing that I'll just say on that is I really like the way that my deputy described it when she first started. She was originally the organizing director on Julian Castro's campaign, and then came on to be the deputy national organizing director for Team Warren, and she just described it most simply as a big ask to a big list. So tying back into something that Claire just said, being comfortable asking people to take on a lot as soon as you sense that momentum, as soon as you've got all of these people that want to do something.
Well, staying with you, Kunur, one of the things I have memories of, and they're not that old, are field and digital people accusing each other on Twitter of being either more important than they think they are or way less important than they think they are. And one of the things that struck me about the whole language around distributed organizing is it looked, not that it was this in any real sense, but it was like, you see, you put the chocolate in the peanut butter and everything's cool again. And I wonder if there's anything I'm missing in that description in terms of the natural tensions that emerge in a campaign when you have siloed departments competing for resources and attention for decisions. Is there some different way that this is playing out today than it would have 4 or 8 years ago?
Yeah, I think so. I think that those arguments were partly just tied to the fact that some folks were doing a tried and true thing, and some folks were trying something that seemed new and revolutionary. And in a campaign, you only have so many resources, and if you're competing for them internally, that can create some tension. A lot of that stuff, I think, has just changed over time as organizers are being trained more and more, even when they are on the ground, on some of these scalable digital tools that are really commonly used in distributed organizing campaigns. But I think it also partly just ties back into the structure and culture of your organization, and how have you set that up. On our campaign, we did have some folks who were more specialized in really distributed stuff. We did have folks who were on the ground organizing face to face. We had folks who were in between, and so making sure that we had good communication systems, strong, just a strong sense of how exactly we all play a part. I think some of that stuff mitigated those tensions on our campaign, and just building a really good culture and understanding of how we wanted to do that work.
Right. Claire, I'm going to ask you something that might be really close to a critique of distributed organizing. So bear with me here. I remember at a training in this a number of years ago, it was explained that, you might get a big group together, and then instead of asking who wants to volunteer, you would ask, who wants to be a leader in this effort? And then everyone who raises their hand, don't let them be part of your effort. Because there's something about this methodology that requires that people be very accommodating of orders and commands and instructions from the top, and is less amenable to the kind of person that we see everywhere, someone who's thinking not just of themselves and their own experience as a volunteer. They're thinking about the community that they represent. They're thinking about their career. They're thinking about what they want to be doing for themselves. And distributed organizing was like a way of cleaving those two kinds of people in half, when all of us have experienced in our lives as activists and organizers and staff that it's not so easy to divide them up. And thinking specifically about how the demographics of people that are willing to be just tell me what to do, that's fine, I'll spend all evening texting, is different than someone who says, I would like to help you, and in order for me to help you, I need to know that you've done the things necessary to win me and my community over. And it's such a radically different way of thinking about how volunteers integrate. How does that come up for you, that given that you're on one side of that equation and not the other? You're not in the political department.
Okay, I think I followed. I think I followed that, but let me know if I didn't understand your question.
Sure.
So I think something that we learned in 2016 was that we didn't want to ask people. We said don't ask people who wants to be a leader here, because if you say who here wants to be a leader, you might get people who actually don't want to do work. They just want the title of leader and they want to tell people what to do. And we called that the tyranny of the annoying, which is that we've all experienced the tyranny of the annoying, right? We go to a meeting and you can't get anything done. And lots of people on the left have had this experience. You go to a meeting and there's one person there who's really annoying, who has a lot of opinions about what everyone else should do. And when you come to the end of the meeting to assign responsibilities and next steps, they don't have anything that they want to do. They considered it their contribution just to tell everyone else what to do. And that was a real problem for us in 2016, because we didn't have systems for managing people all around the entire country. We only had a team of first 2, then 5, then 10, and eventually about 20 people, which we didn't have until January. So we didn't have any way of figuring out, oh, this person's actually a good leader and this person is really problematic and is alienating everyone, all the volunteers who are in their area. And that was a challenge. And then even if you had all good people who were really productive, who did want to do work, it's very difficult to manage people who are operating at different scales. So if someone is with a group of people that's only 3 people, that's very different than someone else who has a group of 300, and they need different kinds of support. So we dealt with that challenge in 2016 by just asking people to do things rather than asking people to take on roles. And that's actually one of the things that I was most excited about, that we were able to challenge and rethink in 2020, where we did think through how we could build deeper leadership over time and more skills for people, and not just say, okay, you're an event host today, you're an attendee tomorrow, you're a texter today, or you're on a special team, but we invest in you and we're giving you a lot of extra skills and we're conferring you with an extra layer of legitimacy. And we did that through a couple different programs. We did that through our constituency organizing program, where we had people who were from key constituencies who became community connectors. This was the first person who really drove this, was our constituency organizing director, Young Jung Cho, who is so brilliant and was the first one who really figured out how to do this distributed leadership at scale, approach that problem. And then we did it through our campus program, through the Campus Core Leader and HBCU Campus Core Leader programs, asking campus leaders to participate through a structured program. And then ultimately, we developed leadership through this program called the Bernie Victory Captain Program, where volunteers committed to spending at least 10 hours a week and being part of a structured program with accountability, where they got special training. And then we told other volunteers in their area, these are the people who really know how to do some stuff, and get linked up with them and they're going to plug you in with the campaign. And that turned out to be one of the most amazing programs that really inspired people and gave them a real sense of identity. And they felt like their commitment was being respected. And they also had a direct line to the campaign to be able to give feedback back to us. And we also, I should mention, took a lot of inspiration from the Sunrise Movement and adopted their model of pairing those volunteers with experienced mentors, so that who are also volunteers, so that every single volunteer, every mentor had a cohort of about 10 people, and those Bernie Victory captains got mentored by very experienced organizers who were supporting them and helping them think through challenges and whatnot. And yeah, so I think to answer your question, we initially in 2016 weren't sure how to solve the problem of cultivating ongoing leadership in a scalable way when you didn't have geographic staff all over the place, and to be able to do that intensive management. And then we kind of figured it out this time.
Right. You've inadvertently, to sort of help me frame this next question. So the kind of people that became coaches, am I using the right word? Mentors?
Yeah.
Those people, a lot of them, when they joined that program, I remember hearing a few tell me personally that they were happy to finally have a role in the campaign, because many of them had been looking for one, trying to figure out, and been unsuccessful until then. And to contrast that a little bit with Warren World, and Kunur is going to be the expert on that. In the Warren World, it felt like that kind of demographic found it easier to plug in earlier. And I'm going to ask both of you to respond to this, but Claire first.
Okay. I think that the Warren campaign, I just want to say, did a phenomenal job at outreach to movement leaders. And I'm not sure how you structure that in the campaign in terms of political versus organizing other departments, how your kind of internal structure worked. For us, I think that was more of a political department program. Like we were working with the masses of people who signed up to volunteer, not really sort of higher level movement leaders. I think that there were plenty of people who were, if you've been volunteering for many years and you wanted to become a deep part of the campaign, there was nothing to stop you from doing that. But in terms of our organizing program, we did not see it as our focus to reach out to movement leaders and to cultivate their participation in the campaign. Our job was to create a structure to maximize volunteer participation,
right,
specifically talk to voters.
Thank you, Claire. Kunur, so we've gone for a long time without turning to you. How do we translate some of what was just said for how things were different on the Warren campaign?
I mean, I think that some of the things that Claire was just describing mirror pretty closely some programs that we did run on the Warren campaign. So I'll speak to that first before I get to the differerences. I'll start off by saying I really admired the Victory Leaders program, and that was probably the thing that I was most jealous of, looking at other campaigns as an organizing director myself, that I wish that we would have figured out earlier on. But in terms of getting folks feeling like they had a role in the campaign and like they were plugged in really early, we started off with a pretty small, scrappy team way back in spring of 2019 in headquarters to do some of the organizing work. Pretty similar to what Claire was describing the 2016 distributed team in the Bernie campaign felt like until January. We had a team of, it was 5 or 6 of us for the entire country outside of the first 4, and we had a lot of volunteers and on the ground leaders and local electeds and folks who were really excited to plug in and start doing work, but were really, really far away from their contest states. But it was really important to us that we make sure that they had a direct line to the campaign, an organizer to talk to, and just resources that would help them do whatever they wanted to do in their communities as early on as possible. So we tried to make sure that we were a really accessible campaign, and that did mean in some cases, we would be connecting folks across departments. So I worked pretty closely with our friends in the political shop. If we had someone who was a prominent volunteer, lots of campaign experience, in the African American community, would they be someone who our African American outreach director knew about? Absolutely, they would be invited to the same conference calls that established movement leaders and people who run organizations and electeds would be on. We did the same thing with women and youth and campus, just making sure that we're integrating both our grassroots, our electeds, and grass tops outreach all together, making sure that we are. I was making sure that we were being really broad with our definition of leadership, and making sure that we were helping folks to feel included. And then as far as other differences go, it's sort of hard for me to say without having worked on that campaign myself. I can only speak as an outsider, but I'll say there were a couple of things that we did that I think were different from a lot of campaigns that felt really exciting to me. And that was really take seriously the feedback of our grassroots on the ground. When we had volunteers who were sharing concerns with us, I would always make sure to elevate those to our friends in policy, to our friends in political, and make sure sometimes that those volunteers could be connected directly with relevant folks in HQ. Just trying to create as open a campaign as possible to make sure that our folks in our movement felt like they were truly part of our campaign and a respected part of our community.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm moving on to a different question. Thinking about what both of you have learned using this kind of integrated organizing techniques, where do you think it's going to be used best outside of an open presidential primary, which are actually somewhat rare? I mean, there are times when they don't happen for eight years or more. Where should we be looking to see the best and most impactful use of these techniques? And we'll start with Claire.
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the world right now, right? And I think that almost every kind of organizing that we could be doing can benefit from using some of these techniques, because we live in a world where things can quickly go viral. And if you look into the Momentum School of Organizing, they're very influential for the formation of Sunrise and If Not Now and Cosecha and a few other groups. They talk about how you have to either wait for moments for momentum to come for you, and or create your own momentum. And with social media, when something goes viral or there's a rapidly changing circumstance in the world, that's an opportunity to get a lot of people engaged. And you want to have a system that's built for scale, that also finds ways to cultivate leadership and have feedback that goes in both directions, and does so many other things. And you don't want to only wait for those moments, because there's so much of the grind that has to happen all the time. But we're in a moment when 22 million people are unemployed, and we're facing a pandemic, and we have the most wildcat work stoppages and worker actions that are happening in many years. And there's an opening for pushing for universal health care, and we're also facing a climate crisis. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done across the board. And I think setting things up in a way that can be ready for scale means that if you have 5,000 people who are signing up and saying, yes, I want to volunteer with you, you have a plan for what you're going to do with them. And it's not just, I'm going to call every person back 1 through 5,000. It's, I know how I'm going to put them all to work right at once.
Kunur, one thing that I'm worried that we haven't done a great job of actually explaining what this thing is. So imagine that, folks are here and they're like, okay, it sounds like this is really important and it might be called distributed. What exactly does that mean? Could you help us understand, connect the actual tools and the methodology that distinguishes this from other things in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tools themselves are less important. Every year, we get more and more versions of the same technology and the same tools. It's more um, the methodology piece. I think is what's more important. And like we were saying at the top of the call, I think every single person that you ask would give you a slightly different answer as far as what distributed organizing is. But to me, it's organizing tons of people immediately at once to do something at scale. It is not going one by one, person by person, painstakingly getting them to do something after 2 months of relationship building. It's about identifying a problem. Um, if you have momentum, like Claire was describing, and making sure that you're capturing that in the moment and driving people to action at scale immediately. Like like my colleague on the Warren campaign said, a big ask to a big list is one simple way that you could describe it. But I think about scale and organizing across geography as at its core what distributed organizing is. And I think for folks where that still seems vague and that still seems fluffy, I would just think about any instance where you have too many people, then you can talk to or train one by one at once. If your ratio of organizers or staff to excited people, supporters, or volunteers feels really wacky, feels like really unmanageable, that's probably an instance where distributed organizing would be useful or would come into play.
Well, there's a challenge here. When I think about the landscape of organizing in the sense of organizations that do organizing and are committed to remaining in the field for a long time, a lot of them are C4 organizations that would define themselves as community organizers. And their relational model, some descendant of the Alinsky school, it's almost like it's based on never doing those things that you distributed people do. And it ensures that the pool of volunteer resources that they have remain tightly connected to the structure and to the other institutions that they spend years building and honing. Then along come these young whippersnappers and like, don't worry about that. We got these text message tools. We have these phone banking tools. You have these distributed techniques. We're just going to ask everyone if they want to shift over and volunteer for this thing right now because it's urgent. I'm not saying that there's a bunch of C4 orgs grumbling about this, but I can see at the community level that there's a certain tension between this new big thing rolling across the landscape, sucking up energy, media, attention, leaving community-based organizations, often with a very specific race and class focus, just a little bit wondering what their role is in that as this kind of organizing gains traction and is used more and more. Kunur, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the two can and should coexist. When you have organizations that have a rich history of relational organizing and deep relationships in their community, that is really, really important, but for a totally different set of reasons, right? A lot of that work is crucial to the work of building long-term power and making sure that they are advocating for a specific set of folks in their community. Now, if that same organization wants to do something really fast in a particular moment, distributed organizing might be something that they pair alongside that. Maybe those organizers who have those relationships, who should be at the microphone, who should be speaking at an event, also want to blast something out to a big list of people and activate a new set of folks for a shorter term campaign. I think like these are things that can and should be paired together. I hear that tension, but I think they can be complementary. I would point to the example of some of the organizations in the C3, C4, and PAC spaces that have done this pretty well. I think Indivisible and Moms Demand Action are good examples of organizations that have built on the ground chapter-based organizations, they've got locals who are organizing individual volunteers face-to-face, building community. You've also got organizations like CPD and People's Action that have lots of local affiliates that are doing that kind of work. But these organizations also have massive, massive email lists of people who aren't necessarily showing up to in-person meetings and sitting in rooms for 2 hours at a time super, super regularly. But if you ask them to do something for a day of action or a week of action, these people would absolutely mobilize. And that's just a different resource. It's more of a hammer than a scalpel. And folks should just think about, what the appropriate use is of each one.
Fair enough. And I'll just add for the benefit of our audience that there actually is a very interesting momentum-inspired group, Cosecha, which represents immigrants and recent immigrants especially, but also uses these techniques. And I'm now feeling sad that there isn't someone here from that group to help us. But turning to you, Claire, what can you say about that tension that is reasonable and exists between these two modes?
Yeah. I think that you're bringing up something really important, but I think that the difference that you're highlighting is between organizing and mobilizing. And I think that there's a reason that people often think of mobilization as the thing that people are doing when they think of distributed organizing, because oftentimes that's what it is. It's go to a day of action and then nothing happens. You're on the email list and it's go to this thing or make calls, and then you don't hear anything else for a long time. So I don't think that distributed scalable organizing has to mean not building leadership or not doing deeper organizing. I think that it can mean, when you look at the Sunrise Movement, 10 years ago, I was just thinking about this today, 10 years ago, when environmentalists were organizing around cap and trade, they didn't have any grassroots infrastructure to build political power in districts. And now, thanks to the Sunrise Movement model of building leaders and deeply cultivating and investing in them, there is an undeniable force in American politics that is going to push for a Green New Deal, and there isn't anything else that is comparable in the entire climate space. And they recruited and trained all those leaders through a distributed model. So I don't think that using distributed has to mean shallow or mobilization only organizing. But I also don't think it's the only model. And I think that there are a lot of other examples of community-based organizations where distributed doesn't make sense for them. And in addition to some of the great ones that Kanur mentioned, I would also shout out an organization like Make the Road, which really inspires me. And I think that it really depends on who you're trying to organize and what the scale is and what the goal is.
I'm now going to take a detour to the distant past. It's right around the 20th anniversary of A16, and I have a feeling that were either of you at the Washington D.C. when we tried to shut things down. And
okay,
this, great.
Charles.
Okay, this
is the first time I was arrested. I was 16.
I'm very old and forget things, but I remember the spokes counts, and I remember how every little group, like the Neighborhood Block Association Anarchist League, and they'd want their own place on the spokes council. There was such a drive to only operate within the context of the group that you belong to, and you sort of want to maintain that as you go through larger moments or protests or movements. And what distributed organizing does is it says, nope, it's just you and your email address and your text number, and we're going to employ you for this work without letting you remain part of the cohort that you showed up with. And I can't shake the feeling that at least some of the time there's something that's being lost as a result of that shift in radical organizing culture.
Well, I think that to go back to the Bernie Victory Captain example, I felt like that was the way that we had to organize in 2016 because we had a very limited amount of time and we had a lot of people who wanted to do stuff. We tried to get around it in 2020. I think that it's very hard to manage groups at scale, and you can easily end up in a situation where you have a lot of Facebook groups that actually just exist in name only and don't do anything, or they're just one person, or people get really bogged down in process. But I've come to think that groups can be really powerful and that people really value having that experience of working in an ongoing team, and that you can do that. But it was important to us in this program to allow people the opportunity to work within a group, but also give some people the opportunity to volunteer without being part of a group, because there are a lot of volunteers who don't want to sit in a meeting. And
Yes.
as much as I do have fond memories from A16 and Occupy and many other meetings that happened in various church basements with activists that we were probably both at different times, a lot of people out there don't want to go and sit in a 3-hour meeting to figure out what to do. They just want to do something. They care, and
are those people really allowed to be on the left?
I think that this is the space that we're in right now, where we definitely want to have a way for people who want to be involved more deeply to work with each other, have leadership, give feedback, as well as receive some training. But then we also want to have multiple points of entry for people who can't make that commitment for one reason or another, and make sure that our movement is open and inclusive, and then also that it doesn't become subcultural, because there are ways that we can really bond together and learn and kind of build a shared sense of identity, but that can also end up being alienating to people who are outside our community or identity, who might actually relate to our politics. And by the way, this is something that my friend Jonathan Matthew Smucker has written about in his book, where he talks about being at A16, and he calls that phenomenon the political identity paradox, that the process of identity formation within a group is really powerful, but then it also can be self-referential and alienating to outsiders.
That has been my experience all too often. Kunur, I'm gonna shift gears here a little bit and ask you a little bit about your experience on the Warren campaign. And every campaign is essentially a coalition. There's particular demographics or interest groups that seem to glom onto a campaign versus others. Could you say something about the specifics of the Warren campaign, the demographics that were early adopters, that were joined, the organizational landscape that you were in? How did that impact the decisions you were making as an organizing leader? I'm trying to find, and I'm asking imprecisely, how did the specifics of that support impact how the campaign went about its organizing?
Yeah, I mean, I can't get super specific about the demographics of our volunteer base, because we didn't really have perfect information about that, and it was also pretty fluid. The thing that I would say is that as an organizer in that space, as in every other, it was one of my express goals to make sure that we were creating as inclusive and as open an environment as possible that would be welcoming to folks from all kinds of different backgrounds. We had volunteers, from every single demographic, every single geography that you could possibly think of. And it was important to me that we don't create a campaign that is super exclusive, where it feels like we are gatekeepers. I wanted to make sure that all of our volunteers could see themselves in the work that we were doing, and really shape the campaign to their community. I will say in some of our state-specific work, we would tailor that a little bit more closely with some of our staffed organizers. We had a lot of incredible distributed organizing happening from our headquarters. We had kind of some blended distributed and relational organizing happening on the ground with our field organizers. And we also hired community organizers in all of our states, and their role was explicitly to make sure that we were doing outreach and bringing new people in, and creating a campaign that was being a little bit more active about reaching out to folks from different communities who might not be represented to the extent that we would have liked in the campaign. So making sure that we were hiring locals from within those communities who could speak to to the needs.
Kunur is on.
I'm still
Kunur, you
here.
can. Okay, great. There was just some visual thing. That's great. And actually, what you're saying fits with things that I've read. I'm thinking, for example, about Medium articles posted by Black before about how the Warren campaign really made an emphasis on being a listening campaign, on finding ways for people at the grassroots to manifest in very particular ways. But there's a difference between reading about that as a campaign philosophy versus what does that look like on the inside. Can you say something about how that approach led to specific impact or not so much victories, but how that impacted the organizing itself from a numbers perspective? Like, how did that make you win a district better than a place where you hadn't been doing that?
I mean, I'm not 100% sure that we could say that. We didn't win that many districts at the end of the day, so I don't know that we could pinpoint one particular thing and say like that was the secret sauce. I think that's always hard to do in any campaign setting, regardless, when you have so much different work going on from so many folks in different departments. We had both field organizing, distributed. We also had an incredible comms team. We had a lot of awesome creative folks and some really important political work happening all at once. So it's really hard to pinpoint one thing, but I can speak to what that sort of philosophy looked like in action on the campaign. I can think of a couple of different examples where we would roll out a policy, or someone from the campaign would say something in the press, and one of the groups that had been in conversations with the campaign or an endorsing organization, found some issues with something that we did or something that we said. And immediately they would be able to find someone on the campaign that they could hop on the phone with right away, and we would immediately start working with them on solutions. It wouldn't always necessarily mean that we would change our position, but it would typically mean that we would have a conversation with them, sometimes multiple conversations, often involving multiple stakeholders in different departments. One example of this that comes to my mind was there was an agriculture plan that we put out, and there was a group of Black farmers that wanted to point out some of the different treatment that they received from federal agencies that they didn't feel was sufficiently addressed to meet their needs in the plan that we had rolled out. So immediately, they could get in touch with our surrogates, they could get in touch with our political department, and then immediately, that same week, we're on the phone with our policy team. So we always wanted to make sure that we were responsive in the moment to the needs of the folks that we were talking to, and that we were taking their feedback really seriously. Because we didn't want to be a campaign that was like, we know better than everyone. We wanted to be a campaign that treated our allies and our grassroots as true partners in a movement.
Well, that really did come through, and from my experience, that was one of the positive aspects that people could point to, regardless of which candidate they supported. If you were giving advice to a campaign to do more of that, how would you phrase it logistically? Because I'm thinking about campaigns I've been on, it's often really hard. You've got only so many principals, and their time is very valuable. And on a certain level, they want to push back against anything that's interfering with them doing their job. What are the instructions for how to bake this kind of listening into a structure?
Yeah, I don't think you always need a figurehead or a principal to get on the phone with someone to make them feel like they are valued and heard. Oftentimes it wasn't our principals that were on the phones with folks who had issues with us. Oftentimes I would be connecting folks in our communications department. Oftentimes it was policy. So making sure that you're identifying who the folks are that actually have influence over the thing that your supporters or the people that are giving you feedback care about, and actually connecting them to the right person rather than giving them candid advice or a mouthpiece. And it starts with a genuine interest and trust in the people on the ground, right? If you don't actually believe in your heart of hearts that their feedback is valuable or worth your time, there is going to be less of an impulse for you to actually do that and connect them with the right person. So I think it also starts with building a team that actually does believe that.
Right. Fair enough. So with all that in mind, if you had to look back and what could you and the job that you had or the teams you were part of, what could have been done better or more or earlier than you were able to? And obviously, there's no implication here of criticizing anyone. It's just what do you wish had gone better?
On my end, I wish that we had started some of the constituency organizing work earlier. I found that it was really valuable and well received, and that people were always so hungry for more. And so I think an earlier investment there would have been a lot better. I think in terms of things that I would have done different, there are a lot of things that I kind of wish we would have stuck to a little bit later, that we did really well early in the campaign, but that in, the intense moments of getting closer and closer to GOTV got harder and harder to stick to. So, back in the days when I was sending organizers around the country to faraway corners, finding full rooms of supporters in cities that you don't normally organize, that stuff was exciting to our folks on the ground. They felt appreciated and listened to and invested in. And I think, allowing for some of that creativity, and sending some of our folks to different places toward the end might have been a little bit better. I think in some of those final moments, there is this impulse to stick to like the thing that you've been doing and your habits and the things that you know. And so if I could go back and change it, I would probably like just tell myself to let loose and remind myself that nobody really knows anything, and that even in the final moments, doing something unexpected or creative is still okay, and often better than the thing that you know how to do.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you for that. Turning to you, Claire, I'm asking you a different question. You've had the great experience of working on the same campaign in a similar role for two successive campaigns. There are many similarities and many differences. Can you talk about what those were like? How did being in 2016 impact the shape of 2020? And is there anything that, even now you're like, oh man, I wish we had done that other thing differently?
Right. Okay, great question. Yes, there was a lot that was different. 2016, I think I'll just remind everyone because it's so easy to forget this, but when Bernie announced he only had 5% national name recognition, no one even knew who he was. And the vast majority of voters were still finding out who Bernie was as voting was happening. And at the same time, there was this exploding level of excitement around his candidacy from people who were finding out who he was. And you were a key part of that, by the way. I want to say People for Bernie was really huge in spreading the word of who Bernie Sanders was in the midst of a complete media shutout and making the country feel the burn. And then in terms of the organizing program, when Zach Exley and I, who some of you know, joined the campaign at the same time in July of 2015, they told us that they had teams on the ground in Iowa and New Hampshire, and that our job was to basically sort of figure out something useful for all the people out there who weren't in those states to do. And there weren't a lot of expectations, but we also didn't have very many resources, and we had tens of thousands of people who wanted to do stuff, and it was this creative challenge that we had to figure out. And we really only got a lot of the core parts of the program that ended up being huge, like barnstorming, the phone banking system, the dialer, mass texting. We didn't get most of those things going until the late fall or even the beginning of 2016. I think we started doing barnstorming on a big scale in December of 2015, and we didn't have the dialer launched or texting, or we had some volunteer event hosting, but volunteers weren't engaged in voter contact. They were just doing visibility events and things. So we had to build the plane while we were flying it. And we kind of, this is sort of mixing the metaphor a little bit, we kind of ran out of runway. We had only just built the system by the time that it was really too late to win. In 2020, we started off, and everyone in the country knew who Bernie was, and he was the most popular politician. But there wasn't the same level of viral excitement because people kind of knew who Bernie was. They'd heard him give the same speech more than once if they'd watched it. And we were instead of going up against just one candidate who was, had a lot of people who didn't like her and had some high negatives, we were going up against a pretty crowded field with a lot of other candidates who people were interested in. So it was a fundamentally different race. And I'll try to go a little faster because I know we're running out of time. I'll just say really quickly that the biggest things that I think were different about our program then were just in 2016, as I said, the distributed program was a program that existed kind of on its own, while the state field programs in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina were really very self-contained. So this time we had a pretty integrated national program where in every single state, sometimes things were done by national volunteers, sometimes they were done by in-state volunteers. We were trying as much as possible to make sure that our limited staff capacity on the ground and our limited volunteer capacity, that they were focused on the things that only they could do. So they weren't confirming people for volunteer shifts. Volunteers on the advanced call team, shout out to any ACT volunteers who are on the call. They were confirming people for those shifts. And they weren't texting people to identify them as Bernie supporters or undecideds. We had volunteers all around the country and around the world doing that, so that volunteers in Iowa and New Hampshire could just focus on knocking on doors. So we're integrated. I think because we had more time and because this was another challenge of 2016, we really tried to focus on having both quantity and quality. So training people on bigger is not always better, and in a Democratic primary, a lot of it is about persuasion. And so emphasizing, teaching all of our organizers, making sure that there's consistent training across the entire campaign. And everyone had skills like how to make a hard ask, how to run a barnstorm, how to support volunteers, and training all volunteers and how to have deeper conversations with voters. So sharing their personal stories. That was a big part of what my Bernie story was about. And also training people how to ask elicitive questions of voters who they're talking to and pivot and connect. And then the leadership at scale, I already talked about with the Bernie Victory Captain program. And then I think that the last thing I'll just say really quickly is integrating constituency and relational as a kind of core part of our overall program, both nationally and in states. Oftentimes campaigns think about constituency as just political. So you work to get the endorsement of a leader of a particular constituency, you roll out the endorsement, you may have a video, you might have an event, but then what happens to the people who come to the event? How do you organize them? They just get sort of pushed into the regular volunteer program. And the way that we tried to think about it was, there are a lot of volunteers where it may make more sense for them to organize by talking to people about Bernie at their mosque rather than knocking on doors in their neighborhood, or talking to people at their workplace rather than just making calls on the dialer, because voters are not just individual people or numbers in the voter file. They exist in relation to each other and in community with one another, and
This makes a lot of sense. Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. I want to turn to Kunur, and just a note to Dwayne: if we don't finish exactly at 7, don't turn off the camera. Kunur, so I'm asking you a different question. I was reading today one of the many tweets that say such a thing, that maybe Warren would become the vice presidential nominee for the Biden campaign, and if that were to happen, it's not insane to think that you might have a job on the Biden campaign, and they might ask you, how should we do things? Because there's a recognition that the way that his campaign operated was very not only traditional, but like absent. He had almost no TV program. There was no field program to speak of. What kind of advice would you give under the present situation where, it is what it is in terms of who the candidates are? How do we integrate this kind of organizing methodology, which is associated with a much more progressive part of the landscape than Biden has represented? How do you fold that in a productive way?
Yeah, I think that they do have, some of the basic infrastructure that we use to mobilize folks, as Claire was talking about earlier, to do direct voter contact. They have a dialer, for example. So they're dipping their toes into this space. I think where I would encourage them to do things a little bit differently would be, I think, similar to the advice that I would give myself if I could do my job over again, which is to do things in a little bit of a more unexpected way. I think one of the things that was a little bit scary for folks who, were on the Bernie and Warren campaigns, were mobilizing so many people and it's still not being quite enough. And that's because we have a lot more going on than just direct voter contact and organizing in this landscape. This is a really complicated year to be campaigning in. And Trump is not a super normal opponent. So I would encourage folks to do things that are creative and unexpected, feel brave, and step outside the box of just direct voter contact and GOTV at the very end, and think about what you can do to cut through the noise in one of the noisiest years we've ever seen.
I want you to keep going. I feel like you have so much more advice to give to a Democratic ticket this year, based on this incredible gap between sort of this progressive camp that was split between a few candidates. They just had an entire universe of sensibilities around policies, around how the methodology, around the kind of people that are hired. And then you've got the old school, which Biden is a good representative of. Where else should he be looking to expand his campaign team or his campaign methodology to really make sure that all these things that progressives have figured out aren't left out in a more standard campaign?
Yeah, well, I think that he should take the working groups that he's setting up with progressives really, really seriously, and use those as places to accept feedback, make changes where folks feel really strongly, make sure that his campaign is as much of a listening one as it can be. I spoke a few times today about how important it was to me in our campaign that we were as accessible as possible and as responsive to the needs of our grassroots and folks who are giving us feedback as we can. I think that's really hard to do, and I think that's something that campaign isn't necessarily known for yet, but there's still time and there's still opportunity to change in that way. I think you're right that they are good at some of that traditional stuff. That stuff I think we've learned is kind of important, but is definitely not the only thing. If he wants to build a really big coalition, there are tons and tons of people who have built up their own grassroots organizations, who have done incredible work in activating their friends and family and their networks. And so thinking through how to reach out to those people, thinking about what the best way is to help them feel valued and seen and welcome into their coalition, I think is going to be really important. And the thing that I want to say is, I don't think that there is like an individual organizing or voter contact tactic that they're not thinking about, or that they wouldn't normally do. I think it's more, what's the culture that you're going to set up for your volunteers? How are you going to welcome new people in? And are you going to create space for them to use their own creativity, do new things, and feel like they have the freedom to be themselves in that campaign.
Nice, thank you. I'm going to turn back to you, Kunor, but I want to go to first Claire and then Kunor for a closing remark. What's your final message to our audience about organizing at scale that folks can take home with them? Claire.
Well, I'm going to jump off the last question to answer this question. Which is that, in thinking about how would the Biden campaign be able to organize at scale, what tactics should they adopt? The number one thing the Biden campaign should do the advice that I would offer to them is to give people a reason to be excited. And we would not have had the number of volunteers who are as passionate about electing Bernie Sanders and put in the work day in, day out, some of them working more than full-time, volunteering for the campaign, truly running the infrastructure, if Bernie didn't offer them hope. And many of them, I would sometimes say it's like they saw Bernie Sanders, the Bernie Sanders potential presidency as their healthcare plan. And that was literally the only thing that, that they believed in. So I think that you can't expect people to get really excited and take on a lot of leadership unless you are giving them a reason to be excited. And of course, many people are going to want to volunteer for Biden to stop Trump. And that is a powerful motivator that is extremely important, but it's not going to be enough for everybody. So I think that the most important thing that we can all do, especially in this moment, again, where 22 million people are unemployed and we're facing a global pandemic, and a pandemic that is, and climate crisis that are going to hurt those at the bottom the most, is to not hedge and to not rein in the scale of our ambition, and to make sure that we're calling for what's actually necessary, not just what seems politically possible. Because if we do that, people will step forward and want to take on leadership to be a part of that with you. And if we are just calling for a return to the status quo, I don't think they're going to be particularly excited to do that.
Thank you, Claire. Kunur.
You know, the thing that I would say to folks who are listening, who are thinking about getting into organizing for the first time, is to just remember that organizing is about relationship building and leadership development at the very end. I think distributed organizing can feel like jargon heavy, can feel really abstract, can feel really inaccessible, but to just remember at the end of the day, it really is about those core things at the heart of everything that we did, whether it was a distributed policy training, whether it was anything else, whether it was some kind of direct voter contact tactic, using some kind of newfangled tool. At the end of the day, we were teaching people to reach out to their neighbors, to share their stories, to talk about the pain that they were feeling, about things that were affecting them in their lives, and just to remember to center, you know, that relationship building, that culture, and really hearing people in whatever the work is that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both. I think that was an amazing and well-spent hour. You are all watching the very final moments of the 2020 Organizing 2.0 virtual conference. It's been an interesting ride. Some of you may have thoughts about the technical glitches that occurred, but we've done our best. And we really, really hope to see you again. Thank you so much. Our hashtag is org20, and please stay in touch with us. And thank you so much.